So let me ask you, before we go to these questions, I'll just take prerogative. So with these wearable devices where you're trying to impart new senses to people that either lack them or maybe it's just a novel sense, is there a frequency limit? I mean, can people respond to higher frequencies than you would expect? Or what sort of limitations do you find?
Yeah, so I'll just mention a technical point, which is all the motors in here, they vibrate at the same frequency, which is optimized for skin, for vibration picking up on that. But this motor represents low frequency, higher, all the way to high frequency. So it's the spatial location that tells you where it is. So it's as easy as pushing a button on the cell phone to make it so that you're hearing the ultrasonic range or the infrasonic, because whatever can be captured just gets translated to you spatially. So the location is what tells you what the information is. And by the way, I should just mention one thing. The way that you figure it out, all these things, is by establishing correlations in the world. So for example, when a deaf person puts this on, at first it just seems like random buzzing, but then they say something and they feel it, and they knock on the door and they feel it, and they clap their hands, but then they watch a dog barking and they feel the buzzing, and that's how the brain starts putting together the patterns, and then it becomes clear what's going on.
That's cool. Okay, so now I'm going to go to questions. So Sophie asks, what is the most recent neuroscience discovery that really changed the way you think about the brain?
It's the one that I mentioned, which is understanding how rapidly the territory in the brain gets taken over. So part of my goal that I mentioned with this book, Livewired, was to illustrate the way that this is a dynamic living electric system. That's not the way that we build, our hardware. But that was the piece of data that really blew me away, is understanding how fast this stuff can change. And that's then led me to all these other things. And by the way, if anyone's interested in that dreaming hypothesis, we just published a paper on it where we compared 25 different species of primates. And across species, you can find their level of plasticity. For example, humans, they take a long time to learn how to walk, to wean, to reach adolescence, stuff like that. But all the, at the other end of the spectrum, like a lemur, right away, it's making stuff happen. It's sort of pre-programmed more than Homo sapiens are. And so anyway, it turns out that how plastic the species is maps exactly onto how much dream sleep they have at night. So anyway, if anyone's interested.
Okay, here's a cool question. I think this is actually really interesting. So Kenton asks, is there a benefit to nearsightedness? Does wearing glasses and vision correction affect competition for the visual area of the brain? Do you sort of rewire when you have poor vision?
Oh, interesting. Let me chew on that a bit, but I don't think so, because the whole point is, how much do you have your eyes open and photons are streaming in? And if you're nearsighted, you might just, hold things closer or whatever, but you're still getting lots of photons in there. As long as you're not walking around in the dark all the time, that would be the bigger problem.
Yeah. So speaking of walking in the dark all the time, Joey asks, do you think there's been any effect of this pandemic, of being, I guess all this social isolation and lockdown, all that, how do you think that's impacting people's brains?
Yeah. One thing we've all noticed is about our sense of time perception. For example, Jim, you said at the beginning about how I was supposed to be there in March, but it feels like forever since that was supposed. It feels like 3,000 years since we were talking about March. The reason is, and this is actually something my lab has studied for many years, is how we put together our estimates of time perception, how our brains do it. It has everything to do with memory. And so it turns out that the way you say how long ago something happened is your brain is unconsciously pulling up footage of all the stuff it can remember. And it says, oh, I've got this much footage, so that must be a year, that must be 3 years, whatever. But the difficult part for all of us is we've been stuck in the same four walls, and our memories are very location-based. And so if you're just on infinite Zoom meetings and so on, it's hard for you to discriminate one memory from another. And that's why when you say, how long has it been since blah, it's really hard to make an estimate because you don't have clear footage about it. So that's one thing that's been happening. The other thing that became obvious at the very beginning is that we don't have the capacity to think very far forward. So, if I asked you at New Year's of this, December 31st of this past year, if I asked you, like, what kind of person do you want to be? What kind of charities do you want to contribute to? Who do you want to be on social media? That kind of stuff. You can think about it, big picture stuff, but it's really tough. And I realize this has to do with essentially Maslow's hierarchy of needs. At the bottom where we are, where we're worried about, toilet paper and food and what we're doing, all this stuff, it's really hard to simulate super far forward. You have to kind of be up at the top where you're self-actualized and you're pretty comfortable with everything. Then you have the freedom to think way into the future. So anyway.
Yeah. So basically not good to be on Zoom all the time.
Exactly. By the way, the very last thing I'll say is, so I have 2 kids, 5 and 8 years old, and it stinks for them because they're in an age where they should be with peers and so on. But I actually think it's way worse for teenagers whose whole brains have turned on the software where the most important thing to the world in them is their peers. And that's what they're supposed to be doing. So I think the lockdown is probably hardest on that group of people more than anybody.
So that's a great point, because when you started off talking about that hemispherectomy surgery.
Yeah.
And typically that's done. I know some history of that. It's done on kids at a certain age where the brain has a level of plasticity, if that's the term you want, that it really does have the capacity to rewire. And I know that there's some, one of the guys we worked with, Mike Merzenich, has brought up the issue that you actually retain plasticity for a long time. But
exactly, yeah.
How do you think about? I mean, you wouldn't probably do a hemispherectomy on an adult, would you? Or
well, okay. So there's 2 things about that. One is so hemispherectomies are almost always done on kids under the age of 7. But it turns out I recently found a paper where there are hemispherectomies in adults. And they work. It's not quite as smooth and great as a kid who you can't always even tell that they had a hemispherectomy. Right. But with an adult, you can tell better. But what this brings up is this point about adult plasticity. And it turns out that adult brains have a lot of plasticity. The issue is this. Your brain's job is to make a model of the world out there. It's locked in silence and darkness and trying to figure out, okay, how do I figure out what's going on in the world? How do I make predictions and so on? And the older you get, the better you are at having a model of the world. Like, okay, I kind of get this. I've seen this personality type before. I've been in this situation before, blah, blah, blah. And that's good news. That's actually what you want. You want a brain that's figuring stuff out. Like a little kid couldn't be CEO of a company because they just don't know enough about how the world operates. Okay, so the problem is the better and better your internal model gets, the harder it is to change that model, the harder it is to get new stuff in. And that's why the brain becomes less plastic, essentially as a sign of its success. It's correlated with its success in making a model of the world. The interesting part to your last question is that for the first time, probably in most of our adult lives, what COVID has done, it stinks in every way imaginable, but I'm just saying it's a tiny silver lining, is that it's forced us off of our path of least resistance. It's kicked us off the hamster wheel of like, oh yeah, I know how the world works, so I just do this. And suddenly we're all having to do a million new things and think creatively about new things. And that's the single upside to what is otherwise a big downside.
Yeah. Thank you for that gift. It's a good point. So how about people, maybe this is, you've sort of opened up, I guess, some of the ware that you've developed for, various folks to do different experiments on, which is a very cool thing to hack and try things. So, one can think about neurological, I guess, handicaps or issues like PTSD, things like that develop sort of later in life. Do you think there's sort of a way to, I don't know, minimize that wiring, maximize other wiring, take advantage of stimulations to recover?
You know what? I tell you the truth. I wish there were better news on that, but it turns out that you have, I'm sure you know this, Jim, but for the audience, there's essentially 2 different memory tracks that you have. So normally an area of your brain called the hippocampus is involved in letting you lay down memories about things. But when something really emotionally salient happens, for example, something traumatic, you kick into gear essentially a secondary memory system that involves an area called the amygdala, and you're laying down a secondary memory track. It turns out that hippocampal memories are actually erasable. This is a very weird story, but it's just true that if you ask me to think of my third grade teacher, and then you were to come and hit me in the head, I would actually lose that memory because I've taken it out of sort of the cemented down form into an active form where I'm thinking about it. And if you hit me then, before I've reconsolidated it, before I've returned it down into a memory, I can lose the memory. So that seems like good news for trauma, but it turns out amygdala memories are unerasable. And so all of the techniques, at least that we know of so far for dealing with trauma, has to do with developing circuits to squelch it. So whenever you're thinking about something, you learn, how to change it, how to think about other things, how to squelch that, but you can't erase it.
So here's an interesting question about dreams. So if you look at the stimulations that, say, a blind person has while they're dreaming, how is that different from, say, the visual cortex? Is it just taken over by a different part of the brain?
It's a great question. What happens in a blind person is, as we saw, the hearing and the touch, those areas take over. The circuitry of dreaming, which is ancient circuitry and is across the animal kingdom, that, of course, stays exactly the same. It doesn't care if you have eyes or not. So what happens is you drive activity into the occipital lobe, this part in the back here, which for us is visual cortex. For a blind person involves hearing and touch. And so the dreams of a blind person, they of course dream, but their dream involves, I was walking around my living room and I felt my furniture, but it's like someone had moved it. And then there was a bear and I felt this bear and I heard him growling and I didn't know what was going on. That's what the dream of a blind person is like. They're feeling and touching.
Cool. Okay. So here's a question from Hannah. It's a pretty interesting question. I think you're going to be able to speculate here. So if you have astronauts in a long-term space journey, never mind the fact that it makes pandemic lockdown look mild. But if you've got a lack of gravity, I guess what does that do to? Can you imagine what it would do to the brain?
Yeah, well, I actually have a section, just a page on this in the book, but it turns out that when astronauts come back to Earth, as you may know, they don't just step out of the thing and start walking around. Instead, they have to learn how to walk again because their muscles are weakened and they haven't done this with their weak muscles and they stumble around. They have to be held. But it turns out they relearn very rapidly, or by the next day, they're walking just fine. And the reason is, actually, I should say it this way. But yeah, the reason is because of what's called savings in the brain. So they're not relearning how to walk from scratch. They're learning because they already had a bunch of stuff that they knew, but they haven't used in a while. And it turns out this is a concept that has led me to propose a very new sort of hypothesis in the book, which is that, when you look at AI, everything going on in AI is about, okay, you've got units and you've got connections between the units, which sort of took off from neuroscience where you've got, synapses that connect neurons. But it's a really babyish way of thinking about it, and it's not at all what the brain is doing. And what I realized is that the brain has actually different time scales of things that are changing. So you have the synapse, the connection between neurons, and that's changing at a fairly rapid time scale. But you have other things changing, the receptors that are expressed, the biochemical cascades on the inside, all the way down to the genetics, where you have change in the conformation of the genome, which tells you which genes are expressing more and less. There's a whole field called epigenetics about that sort of thing. So the point is you've got all these things you can look at that are all plastic, but they exist at different timescales. And the way the brain works is that you change some things rapidly, but the next layer says, hey, I'm not going to believe that until I really see some good evidence. Okay, yeah, I believe it now. I'll change. And it keeps going all the way down. And this explains what happens with savings in the brain, which is to say, if I learn how to speak, sign language, and then I don't use it for 10 years and I forget it, but then I do it later, I'll be much faster at learning the second time because even though I think I've forgotten, it's actually down deep in there.
So here's a question. I'm going to turn it a little bit. And the audience member asking about how mild of a hearing loss do you think could benefit from the wristband device? And I'm guessing that it could be pretty mild. And I mean, you could get new senses with that being mild or no hearing, or you could gain if your hearing's normal. But I kind of think, like I see my son does video games sometimes. He's really, really good at it. It's like a second limb.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so does that kind of evolve when people do these wearable devices?
That's exactly right. I mean, the most interesting part to me about what's going on here is not that people can do stuff, but the internal, what it means to them internally. So in neuroscience, we have this term qualia. It's actually a philosophical term, which is about what the internal experience is of something. I mean, the weird part about hearing and touch and taste and sound and all that stuff is it's all spikes in the brain. And if I were to show you, not you, Jim, well, anybody, if I were to show you or anyone, like a little magical window into a skull and you could see all the spikes moving around, I said, okay, what part of the cortex are we looking at? Are we looking at vision or touch or you couldn't tell me. I couldn't tell you. I mean, it's all made of the same stuff. So, and yet vision feels so different from hearing, from smell, you would never confuse these things with one another. And synesthesia is a different issue. That's where you have some stimulus that triggers something else also. But the point is, you would never mistake. I wouldn't see something and think, oh, I just smelled something instead. So anyway, the question is, what happens when we feed in a new data stream here? Can you develop a new qualia, something that is not vision or touch or taste, but something that's new? And it seems impossible to imagine it, right? But it's the same if I asked you to imagine a new color. It's impossible. You can't do it. You can sit there all day long and you can't imagine a new color. But of course, we know that you can experience different colors. Some small fraction of women, for example, don't just have 3 types of color photoreceptors, but they have a 4th type of cone. And that allows them to experience color in a way that we can't even imagine, those of us who don't have tetrachromacy. But, you're stuck in whatever your qualia are. And so anyway, one of my big interests that I'll know a lot more on in about a year from now is the kind of qualia that we're able to develop.
That's cool. So here's a question that also comes from me. So a long time ago, I used to work with these computers that were sort of configurable logic computers, FPGA computers. You probably know what these are, but it was like an early attempt at, if you had a defect in the computer, you could route around it. It was actually a really interesting bit of science, and it made people think a lot. Are there state-of-the-art interfaces that I guess have taken that idea to a limit that maybe become more flexible interfaces with humans?
I mean, the answer is no. Right now, we don't build technologies that do things. I actually talk about FPGAs for a little part in the book just because they're sort of the closest thing. But it just so happens that I've seen 2 separate books on timing in field programmable gate array chips. And it turns out that these are giant, thick books. Why? Because if you get the timing wrong in one of these chips and the whole thing doesn't work well, that doesn't happen in the brain. And here's why. It's because the brain is constantly experimenting. It says, okay, reach out in the world, hit this, touch this, kick this, touch yourself. And it's saying, okay, look, it takes a different amount of time to process visual information and hearing and touch and whatever. But it's always trying experiments, saying, okay, now everyone synchronize your watches. I'm about to do something. Great, I'm going to kick the world. I'm going to touch the world. And that's how it figures it out. So I actually make the suggestion that the way to bring FPGA chips to the next level is to just make it so that they act more like the brain. They're constantly experimenting.
So there's a question that actually was a little bit on that timing issue, and it had to do with if I can find the question, it's popping around a little bit. A talk I guess you gave. I'm just going to try to ad-lib a little bit here on schizophrenia, where you had hypothesized there was something about timing in the brain.
Yeah, I have long hypothesized that schizophrenia is actually a disorder of time perception, and here's why. It's because, for example, as an example, you're constantly generating an internal voice and listening to it. And if anyone there is thinking, wait, what internal voice? That's the internal voice. You're constantly talking to yourself, even though you're not typically aware of it. But your brain has got to do a lot of work to generate that internal voice and then hear it and do this stuff and get the timing right. And it's trivial for the brain to do under normal circumstances to get that timing right. But what I've hypothesized, and we've done a lot of experiments on this, is that in a person with schizophrenia, that timing gets off even just by a little bit. And if you hear a voice before you think you were the one who said it or generated it, you'd have to interpret that as someone else's voice. That's an auditory hallucination.
Right.
And one of the main things that characterizes schizophrenia is what's called credit misattribution, where a person with schizophrenia will do something and then say, "Oh, that wasn't me. I didn't do that." And it's because they're getting the timing wrong. It's because your brain is constantly, remember, the brain is sitting in this mission control center operating this giant body, and it's these little windows on the world. And so it says, okay, put out an act. Oh, I got information back, but it gets the timing wrong just by a few milliseconds. It says, oh, I was not the one who did that. Because causality at bottom is a timing calculation. So anyway, I'm still exploring that in various ways. And if that turns out to be true, that it's a problem with timing, that opens up an entirely new therapeutic avenue besides drugs to actually train people on video games and maybe cure their auditory hallucinations that way.
Yeah, that's an interesting idea. You taken the idea in your talk of basically wiring the brain through experience pretty far. But there are people who have a level of, if someone is really musically talented, you can kind of tell, if you know what I mean. Because they just have a natural gift for playing music that they can do easier than most people. Same thing as athletically talented. And one of the questions has to do with patients who have had a brain injury and actually come out with musical talent that they didn't necessarily have before. I've never heard of that, but maybe it does happen.
So let me say a couple things on this. The issue is, fundamentally, the question that's being asked is about nature and nurture. And as many of you probably know, the nature versus nurture question is totally dead because it's always both. And they're actually intertwined in very complex ways. So you drop into the world with a particular set of genes, and that sort of constrains where you can go, what you can be. For example, I can't become as good a swimmer as Michael Phelps because he just has a much longer wingspan than I do. But within what you can be, it's your experiences in the world, it's your friends, it's your culture, it's your language, it's your experience. Everything that happens to you determines what trajectory you take from there. And so, of course, it's the case that some kids dropped in the world with better musical talent. But obviously, if a child like that doesn't get exposed to the right kind of environment, he'll never become a Perlman or an Ashkenazi. And and so we all drop in with different potential, but from there, it's all about experience. And the thing that I think is interesting, and I know we got to wrap up. So the last thing I'll say is, when Crick and Watson discovered the structure of DNA in 1953, Francis Crick burst into the Eagleman Child Pub and said, "We've discovered the secret to life." And Crick was one of my mentors at the Salk Institute. And I loved him. I loved him more than, words could say. But what's interesting is that I think they only discovered half the secret of life. And that's really the important part about understanding what's going on with brain plasticity, is that the genome just provides half the story at best. And from there, it's everything that happens around you, stuff that we can't write down in a textbook and never will, because it's what's happened in your life, your trajectory of space and time. That's what makes you who you are.
Okay, so I'm going to finish up with one last question. I imagine you've got, there's 140 computers on, so probably you've got 200 people watching you right now. And everybody's inspired to go learn something new, pick up a musical instrument or do some new task. So let's say you have an hour a day to do it.
Yeah.
Which is not really that much time. So is there like a breathing practice, meditation?
I'll tell you what I would recommend is constantly seeking novelty, how you can do stuff new. So for example, anyone who happens to be out there who's wearing a watch, switch your watch over to the other hand. Just go ahead and take it off, switch it over. If you're not wearing a watch, but you're sitting in front of your computer, move your mouse so you're using your mouse with the other hand. None of this is that hard. But what it does is it knocks the brain off the path of least resistance. So you have to put a little bit of attention back on something that's become like an unconscious zombie. For those of you who don't have a mouse or a watch, brush your teeth with your other hand tonight. It's not that hard. but it forces you to sort of get out of the routines that you're in because the brain is trying to automatize everything. One thing that I always did back in the world where we drove around was I always drove home a different route from work every day. What I would also recommend is everyone, I assume, has a desk where they've got their stuff. Completely rearrange your desk. Move your desk to the other side of the room. Rearrange stuff. Just do it a different way. But this kind of simple thing that I'm talking about, do this all the time. Always change stuff up because that's what keeps your brain plastic and healthy. And otherwise, you become an automatized zombie. And that's my advice.
That's great. I'm moving my microphone to the other side of the computer right now, so I have to talk outside of my mouth.
Great work.
Anyway, thank you so much, David. That was an awesome town hall. It was worth the wait. I look forward. Maybe we'll get you here in person one day when we can all drive around again and do those things.
Can't wait for that.